Chapter 9. James Jared Thomas sat at the window of his apartment, smoking a cigarette, the smoke curled in blue ringlets, echoing the azure hue in his eyes. He flicked the ash impatiently on the arm of the chair, then studied the back of his hand. He watched the pale blonde hair on each knuckle and the gold nugget ring between them. He remembered staring at that same ring a few days before, when Dr. Gray called him into his office. The man and the boy had exchanged pleasantries. James watched Dr. Gray walk over to the fish aquarium, sprinkling food into the water. James noticed the fish didn't seem especially hungry. "What is it, Doc? I came right over when you called." The older man nodded imperceptibly. "James, you asked me to interview Brenda because she seemed to be having sleep disorders, family problems, and so on. You said she seldom sleeps more than 4 hours a night." "Yes, sir, that's right. Every time we're together, her eyes are bloodshot from all that housework, and not sleeping just aggravates it. She told me it was allergies, but I know better," James replied. Dr. Gray walked closer to the boy, looking him in the eye. "James, there's a reason her eyes are bloodshot, and it's not allergies. She admitted to me she'd been drinking for quite a while." James' look hardened. "Yeah, I figured that much. That's why I wanted her to see you." "What would make her do that? I mean, she never—" Dr. Gray raised one finger and continued. "Never acts drunk, James? Is that what you were going to say? I've interviewed her on 6 different occasions, and I don't think she was sober on any one of those visits. And oh yes, she acts perfectly sober the whole time. Based on what she told me, James, I don't think she's experienced a sober moment for over 2 years now." "But Doc, I've only seen her drink once or twice." "Ever see that thermos she carries with her?" Gray continued. "Smell it sometime. It's vodka. She carries it with her all the time. She says she sips it, just a little, every hour, every day, and all night, except for those 4 hours of sleep she does get." It was then that James, totally deflated, had stared at the gold nugget ring on his right hand. He realized Brenda had never let him drink from her thermos on their picnics. She had been hiding it from him. Dr. Gray's voice softened, seeing the effect on the boy. "James, it's not you. She says it helps her to feel just a little numb. Not incoherent, just numb. And she likes it that way. She says it's the homework, and I can accept that explanation, James, but she needs to be sober if she is to feel anything emotionally for anyone." It was more than just housework, Gray knew. But for now, that was all he wanted James to know. "Okay, Doc, what do you want me to do?" The doctor eased into his desk chair, writing on a notepad as he spoke. "I would like you to talk to a friend of mine at the infirmary. You two may be able to help Brenda through this." He tore off the top sheet of the notepad, handing it to the young man. James glanced at the paper, then back to Dr. Gray's warm smile. "Thanks, Doc. It'll be tough, but we'll get through it. For Brenda." "I hope so," Gray thought inwardly, watching the young soldier as he turned and walked out into the street. Their lunch meetings continued through Brenda's 15th year, alternating with visits to see Dr. Gray. Slowly, James gained a portion of her trust. It was inevitable that the family would find out. Eventually, even Margot knew that Brenda was seeing someone. Brenda remembered doing the dishes one day, Margot behind her, hands on her hips. "So, Dorothy tells me you've been sleeping around again, eh? Well, you get this straight, young lady. You have housework to do here, and I intend to see you have plenty to keep you out of trouble. If you have any spare time after that, you can sleep around all you want, you little bitch." Margot's face disfigured itself as she threw the words at the frightened girl. Even now, a week later, the memory had hardly faded. Thursday afternoon arrived, as did James. Lewis had to stay late at the commissary, and James would pick Brenda up from school to spend an hour outdoors, away from the house. The gym activities Brenda signed up for were over for the semester, but her parents didn't need to know that. There was a leisurely drive down Highway 1 toward Kakazu. The two young people climbed the cliffs above the town, staring somberly across yards of land that cost 10,000 lives to cross during the war. Brenda did not carry a thermos this time, but James could tell that she craved one, the magic elixir that she seemed to depend on. "You say your parents will be out of town this weekend?" James asked. "Yes," Brenda replied. "They want me to keep house while they take my sister to the pep squad tryouts in Kadena." "Your sister? What a cow," James thought, lighting a cigarette behind his clenched hands. "I've seen her sister staring at us from across the street. That girl hasn't a chance in hell of becoming a cheerleader. Anyone with eyes would choose Brenda." "I wondered, would you like to quit drinking?" Brenda stared at the boy, open-mouthed. How did he know? She'd kept all the grim secrets of her life and told James little else. "I have leave for the next few days," James continued. "There's no reason for you to stay by yourself cleaning that house. You can stay at my apartment. The only rule would be no booze. What do you think?" For a moment, her bloodshot eyes did not respond. She watched him intently for a clue, some ulterior motive. Did he really want to help her? What if he wanted to seduce her? Small loss. She had to admit he had been a good friend the last few weeks. Would a friend help her? Her intellect rejected the thought, while her heart and soul yearned for him. Brenda looked into his face, and all the fear and secrecy fell away. "Yes," she said quietly, and her eyes embraced him. It was arranged that Brenda would go home, pick up a change of clothes, and meet James at his apartment. James would not go to her house. Margot and Louis considered him beneath their consideration, and the feeling was mutual. James had met Mr. and Mrs. Campbell briefly a few weeks earlier, and the interview was strained. Louis was polite as always, putting on his public side, which was quite charming, but his eyes narrowed as he gazed at the young man. "Brenda tells me you're assigned to the motor pool over at Kadena," Louis said. "Yes, sir," James replied. "I enlisted 2 years ago, right after I turned 18. I could have stayed in the States and worked for my father, but I decided with the war and everything, it would be better to enlist and take my chances before I got drafted into an 11 Bang Bang unit." What an idiot, Louis thought to himself. He looks intelligent enough, but the fool enlisted to become a grease monkey. He'll be stuck in the same job 20 years from now, still in E4. "Well, there's plenty of promotions in the motor division," Louis said, smiling his biggest and most sincere smile. James smiled back. What an insincere bastard. He'd been in the Army long enough to know the motor pool is considered the scum-of-the-earth occupational specialty. He wouldn't understand that I enlisted in the motor pool because it's what I know best. Margot and Louis' opinion of James' future would have changed dramatically had they known that Mr. Benjamin Thomas, James' father, the bigwig, owned one of the biggest trucking firms in the western United States, with connections from San Francisco to Chicago. Even Brenda knew little about the family business. James wanted it that way for a while. No need for Brenda to know that her Jamie stood to take control of a $10 million trucking company upon his return from Okinawa. Brenda walked like a shadow through the house and was almost out the front door when Margot spoke, a phantom voice coming from the recesses of the armchair in the living room. "Going to babysit?" "Yes, ma'am," Brenda said quietly. Margot eyed the tiny cosmetic case where Brenda had stuffed a change of clothes. "Vel, your father and I are going with Dorothy to the cheerleader tryouts. Be sure you get back by midnight and finish cleaning the bathroom upstairs. The clothes are already sorted by the dryer, so all you have to do is put them in and hang them up." "Yes, ma'am." "Margot?" "What?" "When will you be back?" "We'll be back Sunday afternoon. If you got some boy lined up, you keep him out of my house, you understand? You can whore around on somebody else's sheets, not mine." Brenda closed her hand around the cosmetic case and moved on. The screen door closed gently. Brenda was exultant. She was free at last. She stepped lightly down the sidewalk, humming to herself, her carriage still very erect and composed. Soon she would be with James. James was still an enigma for her, but a happy one. She could not understand why he could have any woman he chose, and yet he kept coming to see her. It was unbelievable. Margot had often mentioned how ugly Brenda was in comparison with her daughter Dorothy. Brenda was floating through classes in an alcoholic haze, her bloodshot eyes testimony to her non-stop drinking. As a result of her father's attentions, she was completely frigid. And this was the girl James said he wanted. Brenda shook her head in amazement. The meeting had all been planned. Brenda would walk the 3 blocks to the Scotia cab stand, where she would pay for a 10-mile ride with the babysitting money she had carefully hidden from Margot. Then she would walk the remaining 2 miles to James' apartment near Kadena. Brenda clutched her bundle of worn clothing sitting on the back seat of the little Toyota as it careened recklessly down the narrow 2-lane stretch of Highway 1. She had long ago overcame her initial horror at the daring of the Scotia cabs as they weaved in and out of traffic. Soon she was hypnotically watching the flat horizon met in the distance by that spectacular blue seen only in western Pacific waters. It would be a pretty day, she thought, except for the overcast, which turned the scrub pine forest on the terraced hills from brilliant shades of aquamarine and emerald into a grubby greenness like dusty weeds. Her thoughts turned to James, and her eyes glowed with a new emotion. She remembered their many afternoons together, always rushed as she hurried back to the dispatch office. Now there would be no need to hurry. She would be together with James for almost 3 days, and a faint smile crossed her lips in anticipation. At last she would have a friend to talk to, a companion. The habitual coldness of her heart was warmed for a time as she meditated on this good fortune. Her mind abruptly intruded. I hope I found all of Margot's lit cigarettes before I left, she muttered. What if I forgot to put food out for the dog? The brief blaze of longing she had felt for James was smothered like a slim tongue of flame from a rain-soaked pyre. Brenda stared at the ever-changing roadside, enjoying the parade of small flowers and majestic trees that grew there. Too many cloudy days on this island, she said to herself. As if on cue, a mass of wild darkening clouds appeared on the skyline and was rapidly approaching the center of the island. Sunshine and torrential showers often occurred within minutes of each other. A handful of rain pelted the top of the car, then another. The sound was round and hard like pebbles. Brenda thought of the bleak hike she would face in a few moments. Drops of rain smeared her carefully arranged hairdo as she paid the driver and stepped onto the crushed coral roadway to Kadena, flinching at the ear-shattering thunder overhead. James' thoughts returned to the traffic moving outside the window. Who am I, he mused, to think I can remake a girl, already half-grown and set in her ways? I'm a stranger in her life. She's a stranger to mine. With most girls, James could easily envision the chase, the moment he would bed them, and the time afterwards, the gradually decreasing spiral of dates and movies finally diluted into casual acquaintance once again. Not so with this girl. He could barely imagine making love to her, and as for the relationship after that, he could not see it. It was as if a wall concealed their future together. The more the future retreated, the more avidly James sought after it. There had to be some special significance to their being together. The future James could not fathom would certainly be revealed, if only he could pay the price. What was the price? What was the future? James pondered both these questions, and with good reason. He could not easily answer either of them. What if he failed to wean her from the bottle? How long could he endure a woman who had numbed her mind and her emotions so completely that she walked through every day of her life performing every task required and stayed completely drunk while doing it? What would his other friends think? Oh, they would never say anything in public. That was the worst part of all. What could we possibly have in common, he reminded himself. Do I think I can mold her thoughts Pygmalion-like? The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. James laughed out loud. He remembered Brenda's father, Mr. Macho, and his wife, whose alcohol-laden voice fairly oozed over the phone. In the same instant he saw Brenda, so beautiful in the midst of such mediocrity, and James smiled. She's like a newborn dove, trying to break out of its shell. Yes, there is a cold and lonely exterior, but she cries for love and affection with her soul, if not with her voice. She's an orphan, adrift in a world where she does not belong. His mind paraphrased a poem of Whitman's. To think of today and the ages continued henceforward. Have you guessed you yourself would not continue? Have you feared the future would be nothing to you? Is today nothing? Is the beginningless past nothing? To think that you and I did not see, feel, think, nor bear our part. To think that we are now here and bear our part. God, I'm getting maudlin, James thought to himself. He rose from the armchair and looked across the bar to the kitchen clock. He saw that it was after 6. She had promised to come at 4:30. He sighed and was surprised at his own disappointment. Maybe I was too harsh on the family. Maybe Brenda went with him to the cheerleader tryouts after all. He padded back to the window and waited. James looked out upon the darkening sky. The purple hills had turned an ugly shade of crimson. Rain was coming. Now the lowering sky was torn at intervals with unearthly light, shaken with thunder. James closed the window, leaning back into the deep recesses of his chair, and opened a book. There was a tapping at the door. The tapping came again before James realized what it was. She'd come after all. His heart leaped as he flung open the door. "Brenda!" he shouted incredulously. The shout was not of ecstasy, but of momentary shock. Brenda had walked the 2 miles in drenching rain. Her hair was now matted and tangled, her blouse plastered obscenely against her breasts. The pale shades of makeup she had painstakingly applied ran in 2 broad strokes down her cheeks. "Hi, James," she said in a neutral voice. "Can we come in?" James stared at the pathetic creature. "What do you mean, we?" "You know, the 2 of us, me and my thermos. After all, I don't have to hide any more, do I? At least not from you." She gestured to the thermos, cradled in the other arm. "You're drunk," James said, backing away. "You promised no drinking, starting this morning." Brenda drew herself up to her full height, leaning against a column on the porch. "I did, James, I did, but on the way here, I just lost my nerve. Told the cab driver to pull over at the package store at Koza. I'm sorry, Brenda stopped in mid-sentence, watching as James jumped off the porch and into the street. "Taxi!" he yelled. As the little car turned around, James marched wordlessly back to the front door, grabbed the dazed girl by one arm, and pushed her into the rain. What's wrong, James? What's the problem?" Brenda stammered, stepping blindly on the pebbled walkway. "You're going back home to sober up," he said, not looking at her. "When you're ready to get serious about your problem, let me know." Brenda happily followed the boy. The rain felt warm and inviting. She wanted to rest, to sit down. Why wasn't James taking her into the house? She collapsed at last, still hugging her thermos. "Ah, this is much better," she thought, feeling the warmth of the earth through her pants. James just stared. His jaw worked as he contemplated this pathetic baggage. His love. His darling. "You are a slob, Brenda Jean. You must love death more than life. That's the only excuse I can see for your drinking. Obviously you don't love me, but I love you too much to stand by and watch you kill yourself. I hope you enjoy what's left of your life. Goodbye." James turned on his heel and walked back to the house. Brenda sat in the mud, her mind in a turmoil. The boy's words attached themselves one by one in her mind. A feeling of loss gradually dawned on her. She looked out from behind her bloodshot eyes, seeing only the taxi driver waiting at the curb. James was nowhere to be found. He really had left her squatting in the mud like a beggar. He really had left her. "Well, I don't need him," Brenda muttered to herself. "I'll go home," she announced to the driver, stumbling to her feet. "Nah," she said, one hand propped against the side of the car. She thought of Margot, the unending housework, the insults, and the shame. She tried to think, tried to clear her mind long enough to remember one moment of happiness in her whole wretched existence. One name echoed within the desolate canyon that was her soul. James. Only when she was with him did Brenda feel wanted. Only with him was life a little more bearable. Brenda was tired. Too tired to get in, too tired not to. Somewhere within her lonely soul, a solitary voice cried out from its darkness. "James, please don't leave me. I love you. I'll do anything to make you happy. You're my only hope." The driving rain mocked her. She lifted one muddy hand to her face, but Brenda could not tell the pelting water from her tears. She knew she was crying because of the salty trickle in her mouth. She could not see. Her hair had plastered itself in matted disarray against her forehead. She could not hear, for the tattoo of the wind and rain on the tile roofs had blanketed her in a fog of unreality. She squatted in the front yard, aware of the grinning cab driver, who made no attempt to help her. Brenda was alone, as always. She felt adrift in a sea of uncertainty. "Where's James? Where's my daddy?" She heard no answer but the raging wind. With a convulsive lunge, Brenda freed herself from the bog-like clay. It clung to her, saturating her clothing, seeping into her shoes, engulfing her toes. She fell heavily against the cab. "Come on, missy, I not have all day," the driver shouted above the noise of the storm. Brenda managed to get up on one knee, her head spinning. Her heart pounded. She felt the urge to vomit. The girl swayed, fighting to regain her balance, but the effort was too great. She collapsed. She winced, bracing for the concrete against her skull, but she was floating gently in the air. She turned her face blindly to the sky and heard James' voice above her. "You say you'll do anything for me? Does that include drying out?" Brenda tried valiantly to smile, but the result was only a grimace. "Oh, yes," she said faintly. Then there was blackness. Brenda awoke to the squawk of a bird. Blinking wearily, she raised herself up on one elbow. There was a water glass on the nightstand beside her, as well as 2 photographs in a hinged frame, one of her and one of James. From the dim corner of the room, a familiar voice broke the silence. "I called your parents and told them you'd be back home soon," James said. "For some reason, your mother didn't sound very surprised." "James," Brenda called weakly, raising herself on one elbow. In an instant, he was at her side, holding her hand. "Thank you," she croaked, her voice cracked and hoarse. "You can thank me by showing up here again next Friday, so we can get you on the wagon," James reminded her sternly. Brenda heard the harshness in his voice, but the gentleness of his eyes betrayed him. "Yes, James," she replied, clearing her throat. "I won't screw up next week. I meant what I said. You really are my only hope. I can't bear the thought of losing you." The rain continued until Friday of the following week. Brenda drank until Thursday night and fought the urge all the next day. She took the Scotia cab as before, and the weather was miserable, but this time she felt in control. There would be no stops in Koza. She would do it for her James. Arriving in Kadena, she smoothed her hair again and again in the driving rain, but it was no use. An umbrella in Okinawa was worse than useless during the monsoon season, so she ran the last 2 blocks, finally skipping across the familiar pebbled stepping stones to James' front door. She pounded the door twice before it opened. "How are you?" James asked, looking at her squarely. "Fine," Brenda replied. Satisfied, James opened the door fully, letting Brenda into the apartment. "Let me show you to your room," James said quietly, walking down the hall before her. In one hand he carried 2 marbles, rubbing them absently as he went. "It's not much," he said. "I want to make it nice for you, not the usual bachelor quarters." "Thank you," Brenda replied rather stiffly. She faced James for a moment, aware of their being totally alone. How I would like to hold him. No, men do not understand closeness, the deep and primitive need for warmth and comfort. All they know is sex. The external, the obvious. She was not ready to commit herself. She thought she trusted James, but a nagging doubt clouded her heart until her intellect took over. She backed away, touching the mahogany dresser, glancing at their reflected images in the mirror. She looked into his searching eyes for a moment, then stared resolutely at the floor. "Let me put my things away, and I'll be right out." "Fine, I'll make us both a snack," James said, walking out to the kitchen. The rain had settled into a steady downpour, beating in sheets against the house. Brenda emerged from the humid bedroom feeling refreshed, after washing her face and changing into a pair of white slacks with a turquoise cotton blouse. She tied her long blonde hair up into a ponytail, securing it with a matching ribbon. "You look better," James said cautiously. He wanted to tell the truth, but he knew she would consider any compliment mere flattery, and he did not want to arouse her ever-present suspicion. She took a chair opposite James. He did not attempt to close the distance. James had prepared a tray with tuna fish sandwiches and potato chips. James clenched his 2 marbles, his good luck pieces. Did your parents say anything? James asked, watching his companion's face as he reached for a chip. Should I tell him the truth? Brenda wondered. Well, Margot said a few things, but it was nothing, she replied. They munched the sandwiches quietly. The only other sound in the room was the electric clock on the wall. So Margot said nothing about your leaving? James asked. Their marbles grated on each other. No, nothing, Brenda replied, staring out the window vacantly at the pouring rain. James slammed the glass orbs on the table abruptly. Brenda, look at me. Is it so hard to do that? James' voice had a hard edge to it now. He would make her angry if need be. There was still too much about her he did not know. There would be things he must know before this weekend was over. It was possible that as Brenda's craving for alcohol increased, she would say terrible things, awful things, and he must know more about the antagonist he faced. The drunkenness was only a symptom of something greater, something dark and unknown, and therefore all the more terrifying. What did Margot say to you? He repeated, gently this time. Brenda spoke, still looking outside the window. She told me if I wanted to whore around, I should do it outside of her home. Brenda looked shyly at James now, hoping to use his steady gaze to encourage her faltering nerve. James' face darkened. Why does she use that word all the time? He asked, clenching the arm of the chair. Don't ask me, James. Please don't ask, Brenda said, squelching tears in her eyes. What she says is a lie, Brenda, isn't it? I don't know, Brenda said quietly. James stood up. Mean you don't know what a whore is? I'm sorry, James. I wasn't thinking. It's just that Margot confuses me. Brenda Jean paused, wiping the corner of her eye. A long time ago, James, some man raped me. Right after I came to live with Margot and Dad. Margot told me that any girl who gets raped when they're 11 years old is bad. And bad girls can only grow up to be one thing. But don't prostitutes make money? Look at me. I couldn't make a nickel. Brenda wiped the other eye. There's nothing about me that is good-looking or sexy. My eyes change color like a lizard. My legs look like they belong to a football player. My hair is turning dishwater brown. My figure looks like hell. My hips are too big. I look like a cow. My nose is too big. My teeth are crooked. She gestured towards the table. Look at me. I'm sitting here stuffing my face with potato chips. The salt will do me a world of good. Brenda threw a chip back on her plate, disgusted. James' face softened. Brenda, I'm sorry. I didn't know. About when you were 11, I mean. I should have guessed with your drinking and all. But look here. Your legs are perfectly fine. They're muscular, yes, from hard work, from bending and stooping in that damned house of your father's. Your nose is prominent and aristocratic, not snub-nosed like all the popular girls. Your hair is a beautiful light brown and long, and it has that wave to it you can only see when it's wet. How can you insult the woman I love? I need a drink. Her words fell to the floor like lead. James drew back, stunned. A taste like bright copper filled his throat. A hatred leaped in his brain. No, he said. There's not a drop of liquor in this house, and there won't be any this weekend. He watched in silence as Brenda threw down a magazine, jumped from the sofa, and rushed into the kitchen, throwing open the cabinet doors. One by one he heard them slam shut. All right, where is it? The girl yelled from the other room. James walked casually into the kitchen. I told you, he said, there is no liquor in this house. She stood facing him in the kitchen, her hands quivering. It was a palsied kind of movement, spreading through the girl's frame. Brenda had not had a drink since 10 the previous evening. The delirium tremens had begun. James reached for her, but Brenda collapsed on the floor. James lifted the girl gently and laid her on the sofa, then lit another cigarette, propped his feet up on the coffee table, and waited. Checking his watch expectantly, he did not seem surprised when there was a knock on the door an hour later. Easing from his chair, tiptoeing around the slumbering girl, James opened the front door. Come on in, Bill, he said to the black shape that loomed in the doorway. How's the girl? The faceless stranger said, stomping his boots against the rattan mat before entering. She's sleeping now, but I think she passed out. James retreated into the main room, explaining as he went. And she hasn't had a drink since yesterday? That's right, James replied. Just like you said, she screwed up last weekend, but I think she's serious this time. You told me she didn't care about you, you rascal, Bill Everett exclaimed, clapping the younger man affably on the shoulders. I suppose you realize she is in love with you. Nah, James protested, raising his hands in a deprecating gesture. I don't think she's ever loved anybody. She's so damn cold it scares the shit out of me. The older man walked to the sink, reached into a side cabinet for a glass, then filled it with water. My friend, only a woman in love would do what this girl is doing for you. You don't know how hard it is to go cold turkey. I do. Is the room ready? Bill asked, wiping his Viking-like beard against the back of a meaty hand. James nodded. Well, we better get to it. It's going to be a long night. James and Bill lifted the girl and carried her to the specially prepared room. It was totally empty except for a mattress on the floor. The two men gingerly laid the girl down and left her alone. James was pale. He looked at Bill with a frown. Are you sure this will work? He asked. It's the only way, James, the bigger man said. Remember, I told you about my brother being an alcoholic. This was the only way Mom could dry him out. Luckily, your friend is a lot younger and stronger. Her chances of recovery are pretty good. The only question is, can you stand to watch? Bill put his hand on the boy's shoulder. James considered the future slowly, trying to visualize it in his mind. Bill had described the scenes as he helped his brother dry out, the screams, the useless arguments, the plate throwing, and most of all, the fear. Now James would see it for himself. He must not let the fear come so close. He would have to conquer it by being stronger, no matter what Brenda did or said. She would have to fear him and not the other way around. Yes, he said quietly. I know I can. James, Bill said gently, she will be like a caged animal, you must know that. There will be times when she does not know who you are. Are you sure you want to stay? James' face hardened. I promised I would help. It may not be pretty, but I'll stay. I have to, for her. Good, Bill replied, ignoring the doubt in his own mind. He knew this was the opening episode of a long and tortuous weekend, as the girl drifted in and out of the many moods associated with alcohol withdrawal. You must be strong, he told James. Don't give in to her. James returned to his armchair, picking up the magazine from the floor and idly browsed through it, listening to the storm outside. It slammed against the streaming window panes harder than ever. Hours passed. James began to get uneasy, squirming in his chair, glancing repeatedly toward the silent bedroom in which the sleeping girl lay. Patience, James, patience, Bill said, unfolding his huge arms from his barrel chest. I tell you at the infirmary this would take some time. We'll have to wait. Wait for what? James asked, turning to face his friend. Bill spoke carefully, sensing the concern and love the boy bore for the subject. Bill used the word subject often in his profession. Keep the personal involvement to a minimum. Don't get interested in the patients. Bill had the peculiar detachment often seen in medical personnel, that ability to divorce the personal life from the professional. Bill did this not because of any cold-heartedness, but as a necessity. Not since the drunken episodes with his own father had Bill allowed any personal concern for a patient to fog his mind. The realities of treatment were often cruel and painful, but necessary. Now, sensing James jump at the slightest noise from the bedroom, he realized this was not just another patient. In a very real sense, James' well-being would depend on Bill's ability to help the girl. Bill had known James Thomas for a long time. He had seen James with a great variety of women. Only with this girl, however, had Bill seen such attentiveness, such concern. Be careful, Bill warned. Or girl with the background you describe, alcoholism, mental abuse from the family, extreme passivity, could be a time bomb waiting to go off. You don't know what psychological barriers have been erected by your subconscious. You have no way of knowing when a chance remark, a phrase said in passing, may trigger an emotional upheaval that takes years to correct. Psychologists spend years learning what these triggers are. For you, it would be like walking through a minefield." "I know," James said. Bill marveled at the stoic acceptance in James' eyes, as if the boy realized the magnitude of the task he had undertaken. There would be great responsibility here. There would also be great love for the man who unlocks this girl's secrets. How wonderful to help another human being accept their own self, to put away years of self-abuse, to step forward to a new destiny. How fearful to fail in the attempt. Bill smiled grimly, choosing to ignore this last possibility. "One must always be optimistic," he reminded himself. "We gotta wait, James, because she's not up yet. When she does, don't go to her. She has to deal with the dreams in her own way." "What dreams?" James asked. The subject often dreams. It's as if the psyche, locked up for years under the influence of alcohol, becomes unleashed. The dreams aren't usually happy ones. Bill paused to light a cigarette. He watched the blue haze lazily curl and disappear. Often the subject attains the alpha state, that period between sleep and consciousness, still seeing and hearing the dream. Whatever noise you hear in there, don't go to her. She won't see you. She will see only her dream. We have to let the recovery work for itself. Inside the bedroom, Brenda stirred uneasily in her fitful sleep. She had collapsed in James' arms upon arriving at the house, and immediately felt herself drifting away in a pleasant fog. The years seemed to slip away, and she saw her grandparents again. They were waving to her, grandfather standing with one foot on the running board of his '54 Oldsmobile. There was grandmother, and next to her, a thin and vibrant J.R., as he was in the days of his young innocence. She could not believe it, but her beloved cat stood defiantly against Junior's leg, ready to pounce upon the German shepherds again. Brenda could see other people approaching in the distance. Now she could see Margot, rosy-cheeked and smiling, holding out both hands. In Margot's grasp was a bundle of beautiful, long-stemmed carnations, Brenda's favorite. She reveled in the delicate smells and the glowing pastel buds of red and white. Brenda reached for them, then stopped short as the flowers wilted and changed. In their place she saw a rifle. The bolt was snapped into place, and Brenda watched in horror as Margot's features dimmed to a queasy shade of yellow, like candle tallow pulled away from her skull. The globs of waxy substance fell away from the eyes' sockets, revealing hollow orbs. The melting stuff fell from the hollowing cheeks, and the teeth assumed their grin of death. Brenda dropped the one flower in her hand, running down a misty tunnel. She ran for what seemed like hours, sweat pouring down her blouse, but at last she saw her grandparents' house. Gasping for breath, she leaped upon the porch, flinging open the door and running to the second floor. Grandma would be there, Betty Ann's mother, to keep Brenda safe from the nameless terror outside. Brenda came to the familiar room and collapsed gratefully on the floor, and there again was her old familiar blanket, colored with candlesticks and teddy bears. She pulled it up to her ears, luxuriating in its smell and sweetness. Brenda slowed her labored breathing and lifted a flap of the coverlet. The underside was a living curtain of roaches. They swarmed over the bed as over a dead carcass. They were as active and relentless as maggots on rotting flesh. Brenda cringed, stiff with fright, and her limbs grudgingly obeyed as she leaped away from the crawling mass. She ran for the door, only to find it locked. Brenda felt her heart in her throat. She wanted to retch. Pounding mindlessly against the door, she saw it grow in size. She saw it as a child would see it, looking up into the eerie darkness for the huge doorknob. Leaning against the wall, the veins in her neck throbbing, she saw another movement near the bed. A rodent emerged from an invisible hole in the floor. Soon another appeared, and another. The floor was filled with rats. They were everywhere. They were climbing out of the walls. Brenda felt one nibbling at her feet. She sat up in bed, screaming. The clock in the kitchen showed a minute past midnight. James and Bill had calmed Brenda down and brought her out to the living room, where they could be closer to her. The two men were huddled together, the yellowish light from the overhead lamp casting weird shadows upon Brenda's prone form. James dipped a wet washcloth into the basin of water. The only sound was Brenda's steady, low moan. "It's going to be all right soon," James said. "You'll see. I love you. I know how much pain you're going through. Soon it'll be over." Brenda lay upon the couch, wrapped in blankets. She watched James' lips move, but that was all. Her tortured body would not respond beyond that. There was no hearing, no feeling. It was as if James was in a dream. I must wake up, she told herself. My body hurts. My skin itches. My mind is going in circles. She longed to free her hands and wipe the perspiration from her face, her arms, everywhere. She remembered the roaches and the rats. She focused her eyes and saw worms wriggling mindlessly at the foot of the couch. She clenched her eyes so tightly shut her tears could barely escape. There were arms holding her tightly and something cold and wet on her forehead. There was a glimpse of James bending over her. Then everything went black. Saturday was heralded by a brilliant sunrise, the rays streaming through the latticed windows, burning off the standing rain from the steaming rooftops. Bill rubbed his eyes, sitting up on the cot to see James already dressed, staring out a window and smoking a cigarette. The night had not been a pleasant one. "Morning, Bill," James said as he turned away from the window. "Well, you're in fine fiddle, considering we only got 2 hours sleep," Bill replied, swinging his massive frame over the side of the cot. "I know. We worked our butts off, but things should be better today, right?" Bill scratched his luxurious red beard, fumbling in his shirt pocket for his ever-present wad of tobacco. "Maybe. We can't celebrate yet, although it has been known to happen." Bill scowled around the tobacco in his cheek. "You gotta be more patient, James. We just don't know how she will react yet. You remember last night. There are no guarantees." "We can hope, can't we?" James said, hopefully. "Yes," Bill said with a resigned sigh. No use disappointing him now. Stranger things have happened. I wish to God I could agree with him. "I think I'll walk down to the point," James said, exhaling a lazy curl of blue smoke from his nostrils. "You'll be okay, won't you?" "Sure," Bill replied, attempting to hide his misgivings. "I'll take care of Brenda in case she wakes up. You go on, James. She'll be just fine." Bill smiled his biggest smile, the one usually reserved for the subjects. James sauntered down the gentle slope that led to the isolated, wind-whipped jetty he and Brenda had visited so many times. An ominous bank of clouds was approaching rapidly from the east, but James did not notice. His thoughts had traveled backwards to the happy times with the girl. He recalled her delight at the delicate flowers that grew along the coral beaches of Naha. He remembered her uninhibited pleasure at the sight of every blossom as he delivered one after another for her eager inspection. Once they had gone snorkeling, James hinting that they might stumble upon some rare and beautiful specimens. "Who knows," he hinted archly, "there might even be a black pearl hidden in a coral cave." This alone convinced Brenda to conquer her normal fear of water and join him on that wonderful afternoon. Even now, James could recall the overpowering radiance of the girl as she stepped into the surf with him. Her slim ankles split the water with easy strides, her translucent skin sparkling with minute, salt-laden droplets of indigo and aquamarine. Her long blonde hair was bound in a ponytail, the hair streaming down her back. She'd worn a bikini especially for James, against her better judgment. She thought it accented her large hips, but to James she was an astounding beauty. He remembered his first sight of her. She stripped off a cotton blouse and slacks that day at Machinado Point. He remembered the luscious curve of her breast into the bikini top, the fabric barely wide enough to contain the voluptuous curves of flesh. He remembered with pleasure the well-muscled thighs and the rhythmic sway as she walked, and even now he fought a congested feeling in his loins. How free she seemed then, so alive and vibrant, exulting in the sea breeze, herself a creature of the sun. He loved taking her out to the beach, away from her father's house, but then she underwent a radical transformation. It was as if, with James, Brenda was a different person. He had known many reasons for her reticence, not all yet, but it did not matter. James was on the beach, alone, with the woman he loved, and he did not allow such precious afternoons to be contaminated or shortened in any way. James shook his head, aware he had been daydreaming. He scanned the smoky blue horizon, frowning at the clear sky. Was that a thunderclap he just heard? He looked towards the east, where a moment before he remembered cloud banks. Nothing but blue sky. He stood on the miry turf of his grassy overlook, uneasy with the silence, when he heard it again. This time it was plain. James bounded to his feet instantly, his heart in his throat. He skidded up the gravel path, each step digging madly for a foothold. Bill was shouting from the back porch. "James, get here quick!" Shit, James said under his breath, still 20 yards from the house, the words barely escaping his lips. "Is Brenda Jean all right? Where is she?" James demanded, clearing the 3 stair steps to the wooden sun deck. "She's awake," Bill said, his eyes still bleary from his disturbed sleep. "She keeps screaming something about roaches and rats and beating the walls. Damn, what was that?" Bill spun around when an ear-splitting crash came from the interior of the house. There was a metallic screech, then a dull thud, before both men flung open the screen door and bounded inside. James and Bill scanned the room in disbelief. Lamps were overturned, tables were broken, mirrors were smashed. The orderly pile of magazines beside James' armchair had been scattered all over the floor. Torn pages floated in the delicate breeze from the overhead fan, mute testimony to the whirlwind that had violated the house. "Brenda, are you all right?" James yelled, running for the hallway. He stopped midway in his flight, staring dumbly at the room where the girl had been. The door was hanging by one bent hinge, swinging side to side. Brenda was nowhere to be found. In his confusion, James raced through his mental list of emergency phone numbers, trying to recall one from the military police. Obviously, somebody had abducted the girl. Her father, no doubt. Lewis Kimball wouldn't be satisfied with taking the girl. He would have to ransack the house. But who told? James was selecting culprits in his head when he heard a shout from the other end of the house. "James, over here!" Bill yelled. James ran to the bathroom from where the voice had come. "She's choking on her own vomit," Bill said over his shoulder. "Get some wet wash rags and help me clear her airway." Bill was huddled over Brenda at the side of the bathtub, wiping her sweat-soaked forehead as she grasped the edge of the tub, heaving. James could see her fingers were pinched white, her face a blood-red flush. "Easy now, Brenda. Everything will be just fine. Relax, relax," James said soothingly. He said the words, but he did not believe them. He stared at the retching girl, her hair sweat-stained, dark and stringy. He noticed wrinkles around her eyes he had not seen before. He saw her legs spread obscenely across the porcelain tub. "There's no beauty here," he said unconsciously, then cursed himself for the thought. He saw a drunkard, suffering all the agonies reserved for those people. "Are you sure this woman is so necessary to you?" an inner voice asked. James passed Bill another washcloth and turned his full attention to the girl, silencing the evil ravings of his own soul with the iron grip of his will. The afternoon sun was beating down mercilessly on the red tile roofs of Cadena. James stared intently at the crisscross patterns of the window screen against the plank floor. Today is Sunday. Tomorrow she goes back to her parents, he thought, almost gratefully. The episode at the bathtub was repeated several times before nightfall, leaving everyone exhausted. The house looked like a hurricane had passed through it. There had been no further outbursts from Brenda like the day before, when she had crashed through her room, fleeing the demons of her dreams, demolishing everything in her path. She had slept through the night, while the 2 men took their post outside her bare room until morning. Brenda sat quietly across the room from James, looking miserable. She had washed her hair. It sparkled in spite of the humid weather. Tied back with a white ribbon, the fabric made a striking contrast with her slim, tan neck. She wore a sky-blue blouse with matching culottes, but today the shade seemed overdone, overpowering her pale complexion. Brenda had tried desperately to keep the conversation going all morning, but to no avail. "James," she tried again, "I know being with me has not been easy, but please understand, I didn't know what I was doing. I really didn't." The expression on James' face retained its stony demeanor. "I know," he said flatly. "Please look at me, James. Don't ignore me." The quiet in the room was oppressive. The only sound was the monotonous whirring of a teakwood fan overhead. Bill coughed, shifting in his chair uncomfortably. "You don't love me anymore, do you?" Brenda said at last. "Well, I don't blame you. It's just—" The fan whirred on. James stared out the window. Abruptly, Brenda jumped out of her chair and whipped the screen door open with a bang, running down the slope behind the house. James followed her with his eyes but did not get up. "I love you," James wanted to say, but the words were hollow and sounded like brass. A part of him wanted to make her suffer, and the words went unsaid. Sobs floated in on the gentle sea breeze. "Well?" Bill said. Well, what? James said, still staring vacantly. Aren't you going to go to her? Bill asked. Yeah, James said, but the tone of his voice was not pleasant. He rocked back and forth, his long fingers drumming on the screen of the window. Brenda wandered about the grassy stubble of the yard, oblivious of the sharp rocks and coral outcroppings that cut into her shins as she stumbled blindly down the path. She turned, as always, to those things of nature rather than mankind. Her eyes surveyed the shoreline, following its horseshoe shape into the blue-green distance of Naha Harbor. The pine trees, which used to remind her of the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina, merely mocked her today with their flat, deformed shapes. Stunted and malformed, just like me, she thought bitterly. Why didn't I notice it before? Why did I ever think James would want me once he found out I was a drunk? How stupid. Respect must be earned. Love, the highest degree of respect, comes after years of attention, of duty. I've been in my parents' house 6 years. Why should they care for me? Margot isn't our mother. Why should she care about Junior and me? Dorothy, Lawrence, Alan, and Elizabeth are her children. Daddy rapes me because I've interfered with his happy home. I'm the intruder, and he resents me. Brenda hung her head in wretched agreement with his mental assessment. She pondered these thoughts and others more vicious, ideas going nowhere, answers without questions, questions without reason. She could not tell whether these ideas were the remains of her alcoholic stupor or the beginnings of rational thought. Brenda threw herself on the ground next to a grotesque ornamental shishi dog, one of thousands of stone statues that adorn the island since time immemorial. Brenda lay her head against the rough edge of the monument, releasing her sorrow in halting bursts of tears. She wept like the woman she had been for more than 6 years, fully aware of the futility of life and the probability that her future would be just as bleak. Lost in her solitary despair, Brenda did not hear heavy footsteps approaching. Bill, the burly giant, had become worried when the girl had not returned. He looked down at the girl, her elbows propped up at her knees, resting her chin on her hands. He sighed and looked out to sea. Bill coughed loudly. He hates me, Brenda said in a matter-of-fact voice. No, he said. He just sits in his chair staring. I can't bear it. If he loved me... Brenda, I won't tell you that he loves you. That's something between you and James. I only know what I've seen. Bill lowered his massive frame onto the ground, then reached for his ever-present tobacco pouch. He spoke slowly and deliberately as if to himself. He asked me to help a friend. It wasn't until I met you that I understood what true friendship was. You're a beautiful woman, Brenda. But James didn't do this for sex alone. He could have sex anywhere along Namanui Boulevard, you know it as well as I. He wants you, but he also loves you. Bill paused to spit some juice on the ground. They used to call it agape in Sunday school. I wish the so-called religious would leave it alone. Not 1 in 1,000 has seen it. I have. I see it between you and James. Selfless and absolute love for somebody's welfare. That's what it is. Brenda had stopped crying. She was oddly touched. I had no idea you knew so much about our relationship, she said, daubing her reddened eyes with the palm of one hand. I don't know very much, Bill agreed. It's just obvious that you and James care deeply for each other. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a handkerchief. Here. I don't know how I'll repay him for the broken lamps and things, Brenda mused, taking the handkerchief. I have about $100 in babysitting money. I know it's not enough. Her voice trailed off miserably. Bill gripped the girl's shoulders, his hazel eyes warm yet forceful. More like $5,000 of broken stuff back there. Brenda's face paled as her eyes widened in horror. No! She shrieked, her fist doubling up against her knees. Brenda, don't worry about the money. James' parents... Bill stopped abruptly, glancing conspiratorially to the house. Never mind. I'm sure James will tell you when he's ready. You've made a lot of progress this weekend. Bill lit a cigarette, standing silently with Brenda as he looked beyond Kadena Harbor to the shimmering ocean beyond. Touching Brenda's shoulder, he turned and walked back to the house, leaving her alone on the hillside. Brenda felt disoriented, exhausted, partly from Bill's revelations and partly from the diminishing effects of the alcohol on her body. Why does he put up with me, she thought. Why does he love me? You bitch, that's what Margot calls me. The girl looked into the brilliant oriental sky and saw pinwheels of light, prisms and diamonds of yellow and blue. She leaned sharply into the little stone dog at her back. The pain reminded her of the episode in the barn at Hopkinsville, when she woke up in the barn, her dress caked and matted with a dark reminder of someone's love. Try to appreciate James' love. She saw the word in her mind. It was not capitalized in the biblical sense, but started out very small. In fact, she could trace the genesis of the word to the apartment house on Oak Creek Avenue. It illuminated her earliest visions of the dark rooms, heavy with deep shades of green, relieved by blonde tables and chairs. The massive fireplace was outlined in rolled oak flutings and columns, stately in the somber house. The room seemed warm and protective of the infant who toddled up and down the mysterious stairs leading to unknown mysteries above. Brenda remembered the chores at Margot's house. "Brenda, you must learn to do the dishes," Margot would say. "Here's a stool for you to stand on." The tiny girl could barely extend her pudgy fingers over the sink to plunge them into the scalding, soapy water. Margot would smile as the child labored, commenting from time to time on her progress. "See, this pan is still very dirty, isn't it? We will wash it again, eh? You may use the steel wool scrubbing pad if you want." The girl would finish the pile of greasy dishes in 2 hours, laboring to clear the drain before another family member appeared with more. Lawrence, Jr., Dorothy, or Daddy often ate in the living room in front of the television. Brenda's little hands would be cracked and reddened by the time Margot inspected the last dish and pronounced it suitable for drying. Drying and putting away the dishes only took half as much time as the washing, so Brenda would finish this chore by 8 at night. As she grew older, she was assigned more duties. This was the love she received from her stepmother. The young girl would trudge gratefully up to her tiny room at night, barely remembering the stealthy entrance of her father and the familiar sounds as he dropped his pants to the floor. As he lay upon her, she would stare at the ceiling, her mind a whirlpool of exhaustion within a vacuum of confusion, and ask an invisible God, "Is this another kind of love?" "Brenda, can you hear me?" The girl shook herself out of the reverie, squinting her eyes against the glare of the noon sun, and looked up to see James and Bill kneeling beside her. "You were gone so long I got worried." Brenda felt sweat running down her back. Her back ached, her legs felt numb. "I think I need a drink," Brenda said, her eyes focusing at last. James looked at her warily. No, I don't mean that kind," Brenda said in mock horror. "How about a glass of ice water? I'm bone dry." Later that afternoon, Brenda helped clean up the apartment before returning to Naha. Brenda apologized again and again to James, and his gentle answers quieted her restless spirit. There was a wonderful lunch, with grilled hamburgers, hot dogs, native fruits, and a deliciously fattening vanilla milkshake. Conversation was subdued but friendly. The men were careful to keep the conversation upbeat. Little was said about the Campbells. Bill and James regaled Brenda with happy stories from their own families. Bill left shortly after the noon meal. There was nothing left now but to tidy up the rooms and say goodbye. James would stop from time to time for a cigarette, reaching casually out to touch Brenda to reassure her. She would back away unconsciously, a reflex. "I'm sorry, James," she would say, dusting the counter ferociously. James shrugged and moved to the other side of the room, holding his irritation behind the icy blue eyes that narrowed imperceptibly. The house was eerily silent as the two cleaned and straightened, each absorbed in their own thoughts. "Well, I guess it's time to go," James said at last, bringing a stack of neatly folded clothing from the girl's room. Brenda lay aside her cleaning rag, realizing with dismay it was already 4 o'clock. "I guess so," she replied, brushing the hair out of her face and walking slowly to the front door. She lowered her head as James stepped across the threshold. James was about to step out onto the gravel walkway when, to his amazement, Brenda flung her arms around him and cried out, "James! Whatever people say about me, promise you won't ever leave me. I love you so."